28 men. One ship. Trapped in a frozen hell with no hope of rescue. For nearly 2 years, they would fight for survival in the most inhospitable place on Earth, where temperatures plunge to 70 below zero and the sun disappears for months at a time. Every single one of them should have died. But they didn't. This is the story of Ernest Shackleton's endurance expedition, the greatest survival story ever told. Ernest Shackleton was born in Ireland in 1874, but adventure called him south. By 1914, he had already carved his name into Antarctic history, coming tantalizingly close to the South Pole in 1909 before making the agonizing decision to turn back just 97 miles short. While some called it failure, Shackleton proved something far more important: he valued the lives of his men above personal glory. His wife later said he came home with all his men, and that mattered more than any record. But the South Pole had fallen to Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen in 1911, and Shackleton needed a new challenge. He envisioned something even more audacious: the first crossing of the Antarctic continent from sea to sea, an 1,800-mile journey across unknown territory. He called it the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. The plan was bold and dangerous. His ship, the Endurance, would take him to the Weddell Sea on one side of Antarctica, while a second ship, the Aurora, would lay supply depots from the opposite side. Shackleton and a small party would trek across the continent, becoming the first humans to accomplish this extraordinary feat. Shackleton commissioned the Endurance in 1912. Built in Norway, she was a marvel of polar engineering, 144 feet long with a hull constructed from carefully selected wood up to 30 inches thick in places, specifically designed to resist ice pressure. The ship could carry enough supplies for 2 years and had a coal-fired steam engine to supplement her sails. Shackleton reportedly chose her name from his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." It would prove grimly prophetic. Finding men proved surprisingly easy. Shackleton placed an advertisement that has become legendary, though its exact wording is disputed. The essence was clear: dangerous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Over 5,000 men applied. Shackleton interviewed candidates personally, sometimes for just minutes. He looked for optimism, patience, and most crucially, the ability to maintain good humor under strain. Technical skills mattered, but personality mattered more. One man was reportedly hired because Shackleton liked his smile. Another because he looked funny. The crew Shackleton assembled represented the best of their trades. Frank Worsley, a brilliant New Zealand navigator with an almost mystical ability to find position by dead reckoning. Frank Wild, Shackleton's loyal second-in-command who had accompanied him on previous expeditions. Tom Crean, an Irish seaman of legendary toughness. Frank Hurley, an Australian photographer whose images would document everything to come. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist who brought his banjo. Harry McNish, the Scottish carpenter, traveling with his cat, Mrs. Chippy. 28 very different men, about to face the ultimate test. On August 8, 1914, as Europe descended into the chaos of World War I, the Endurance departed from Plymouth, England. Shackleton had actually offered to cancel the expedition and place his ship and crew at the service of the war effort, but First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill sent a one-word telegram: proceed. So they sailed south, stopping first in Buenos Aires, then at the remote whaling station of Grytviken on South Georgia Island, the last trace of civilization before the ice. The Norwegian whalers at Grytviken offered troubling news. The ice conditions that season were the worst in living memory. The Weddell Sea was locked solid with pack ice far earlier than usual. They urged Shackleton to wait, perhaps until the next season. But Shackleton had invested everything in this expedition, financially and emotionally. Delay meant potential bankruptcy and the dissolution of his carefully chosen crew. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance left South Georgia and sailed into the Weddell Sea. For weeks, they navigated through increasingly dense pack ice. The crew remained optimistic, even excited. This was the adventure they had signed up for. The Endurance pushed south through scattered floes, sometimes ramming through barriers, sometimes finding channels of open water. But as they moved deeper into the Weddell Sea, the ice thickened. Progress slowed to a crawl. Then, on January 19, 1915, just 1 day's sail from the Antarctic mainland and their planned landing point, the ice closed around them completely. The Endurance was trapped. Held fast in pack ice that stretched to every horizon. Shackleton ordered the fires banked to conserve coal and the crew settled in to wait. Surely the ice would break up soon. Antarctic summer was approaching. They just needed patience. But days became weeks. Weeks became months. The ship drifted helplessly, frozen in place, carried by ocean currents beneath the ice. The transcontinental crossing would never happen. The expedition's goal had become something far simpler and far more desperate: survival. The ice held them like a prison with walls that stretched forever in every direction. As January turned to February, then March, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The Endurance wasn't going anywhere. Shackleton faced a truth that would have broken lesser men: his expedition was over before it had truly begun, and now 28 lives depended entirely on his leadership. But if the crew expected panic or despair from their leader, they saw none. Shackleton had a remarkable gift for maintaining morale, and he would need every ounce of it in the months ahead. Shackleton understood that idle men in extreme conditions become despondent men. He immediately established routines to keep everyone occupied and spirits high. The crew organized football matches on the ice beside the ship. They held dog sled races with the expedition's sledge dogs. Evening entertainment became ritual: someone would play the banjo, men would sing songs, and they'd hold debates on absurd topics just to keep their minds active. Hussey's banjo became so important to morale that Shackleton later insisted it be taken even when they had to abandon almost everything else. Scientific work continued. The crew took meteorological readings, measured ice thickness, and documented their slow drift northward. Shackleton also made a crucial decision about hierarchy. While he maintained command structure for safety and efficiency, he abolished many class distinctions common on ships of that era. Scientists and sailors ate together. Everyone took turns at mundane chores. This equality proved vital. In their ice prison, resentment and division could prove as deadly as the cold. By treating every man with respect and ensuring fair treatment, Shackleton created unity when they needed it most. Life aboard the trapped Endurance settled into an almost domestic routine. The men converted living spaces to maximize comfort. They insulated walls with spare materials. McNish, the carpenter, built improvements to their quarters. Meals became important social occasions, and the cook worked miracles with their supplies. They celebrated birthdays and holidays with whatever festivity they could muster. Photographer Frank Hulley documented everything, creating an extraordinary visual record. His photographs and film footage show men who appear remarkably cheerful given their circumstances, testament to Shackleton's leadership. But beneath the forced normality, danger lurked constantly. The ice was not static. It moved, shifted, and groaned under the pressure of winds and currents. Great ridges would suddenly thrust upward as ice sheets collided. Pressure waves would ripple across the frozen surface. The men could hear it. Deep creaks, sharp cracks, thunderous booms that echoed across the ice. The sound was unsettling, a reminder that they sat atop a dynamic, violent environment that could crush their wooden ship like matchsticks. As autumn approached in late March, temperatures plummeted and the Antarctic sun began its long goodbye. By mid-May, the polar night descended completely. For 4 months, they would live in perpetual darkness, lit only by moon, stars, and the eerie dance of the aurora australis. The psychological toll of endless night cannot be overstated. Human beings are not meant to live without sunlight. Depression, irritability, and lethargy become constant threats. But Shackleton kept them busy, kept them focused, kept them together. Through the winter months, the Endurance drifted slowly northward, carried by the current beneath the ice. They logged their position regularly. By late July, the sun finally returned, lifting spirits considerably. But the respite was brief. In August, as spring arrived in the Antarctic, the ice began to move with terrifying power. This should have been good news, a sign that breakup was coming and they might escape. Instead, it became their nightmare. The pressure began gradually. Ice floes collided and compressed. Pressure ridges formed around the ship, great walls of shattered ice thrust upward by unstoppable forces. The Endurance, designed to resist ice, began to groan under the strain. Her timbers creaked ominously. Shackleton ordered the crew to stockpile supplies on the ice, preparing for the possibility they might need to abandon ship. They created supply dumps at a safe distance, hauled sledges and equipment out, prepared the lifeboats. It was exhausting work, but it might save their lives. On October 24, 1915, after 10 months trapped in the ice, the end came. Pressure waves struck the Endurance with incredible force. Ice crushed against her sides. The stern lifted. Timbers splintered with sounds like gunshots. Water began pouring into the hull. Shackleton gave the order that must have broken his heart: abandon ship. The men scrambled to save what they could, hauling supplies across the ice as their ship, their home, their sanctuary, was slowly destroyed before their eyes. For 3 more weeks, the Endurance remained partially intact, her mast still visible, listing at an impossible angle. She had become what Shackleton called a fearful sight. The men salvaged what they could from her broken hull. On November 21, she finally succumbed. The ice crushed her completely, and the Endurance disappeared beneath the frozen surface, taking with her any remaining hope of an easy rescue. Frank Hurley managed to save photographic plates, diving into the flooded ship to retrieve them, giving us the haunting images we have today. Now they were truly alone. 28 men camped on drifting pack ice, over 1,000 miles from the nearest land, with 3 small lifeboats, limited supplies, and no means of communication with the outside world. The ship that was meant to carry them to glory had become their tomb beneath the ice. But they were alive, and as long as they lived, Shackleton would find a way to bring them home. The real test of survival was just beginning. They were homeless now, living on a raft of ice in the middle of nowhere. The Endurance was gone, crushed and swallowed by the frozen ocean. Everything they had left fit into 3 lifeboats and whatever they could carry on sledges. Shackleton gathered his men and made a simple declaration that would define everything that followed: ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home. No drama, no despair, just a statement of purpose. They would survive, and they would make it back. But how do you walk home across an ocean of shifting ice? Shackleton's plan was straightforward in concept, terrifying in execution. They would march west across the ice toward Paulet Island, where he knew an old emergency supply depot existed from a previous expedition. The distance was about 340 miles. It sounded achievable until you considered the reality. Hauling lifeboats and supplies across broken pack ice, through pressure ridges that rose 20 feet high, over surface that could crack open without warning. They named their ice camp Ocean Camp and began preparations for the march. The march began on October 30, 1915. Within hours, they knew it was impossible. The ice was a chaotic nightmare of ridges, leads of open water, and unstable surface. Hauling the boats was backbreaking work that yielded perhaps 2 miles of progress for an entire day's exhausting labor. Men sank to their waists in soft snow. Sledges broke. Tempers frayed. After 3 days, they had covered less than 10 miles and were utterly spent. Shackleton made another hard decision. They would stop and establish a new camp. They called it Patience Camp, and the name was no accident. They would wait for the ice to drift closer to land, conserving their strength rather than wasting it on futile effort. Patience Camp became their home for the next 3.5 months. It was a miserable existence. They lived in tents on ice that could break apart at any moment. Temperatures remained brutally cold. Supplies were strictly rationed. The seal and penguin meat that had seemed novel at first became monotonous and barely adequate. Shackleton knew that hunger could destroy morale as surely as the cold, so he made sure everyone received equal shares, himself included. There was no privilege, no extra rations for the officers. They were all in this together. The psychological strain was immense. These men had been away from civilization for over a year now, trapped first on the ship, now on the ice. They had no communication with the outside world. Their families had no idea whether they were alive or dead. The war in Europe continued without them. Everything they had known was moving on while they remained frozen in time and space. Some men showed signs of breaking. Shackleton watched them carefully, adjusting duties, offering encouragement, sometimes just sitting and talking. His ability to read his men and address their needs before problems escalated was extraordinary. Food became an obsession. Men would lie in their sleeping bags describing elaborate meals they would eat when they got home. They talked about restaurants, family dinners, favorite dishes. These conversations were both torture and comfort, a way to remember that another world existed beyond the ice. The expedition's dogs, which had been companions and workers, faced a grim fate. Supplies were running critically low, and the dogs consumed precious resources. Shackleton made the agonizing decision to shoot them. It was necessary for survival, but the men wept as their loyal animals were killed. They kept one dog team initially, then eventually those dogs too had to be destroyed. Through December and January, the ice floe they camped on drifted slowly northward. They could do nothing but wait and hope. The floe itself was shrinking, melting around the edges as they moved into warmer waters. What had been a stable platform became increasingly precarious. Cracks would appear suddenly, running right through the camp. Men would have to leap across widening gaps. Once, a crack opened directly beneath a tent while men slept inside. They woke to find themselves on separate ice floes and had to quickly bridge the gap before it widened further. By late March 1916, they had drifted far enough north that open water appeared around them with increasing frequency. The ice was breaking up at last, but this brought new dangers. Their floe was now just one piece among thousands, and it was shrinking daily. On April 8, a crack split their camp in half. One man fell into the frigid water in his sleeping bag and had to be hauled out quickly before hypothermia set him. They were out of time. The ice that had been their prison for 16 months was about to become their grave unless they took to the boats. On April 9, 1916, Shackleton gave the order to launch the boats. They loaded the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, with their remaining supplies and pushed off into the Southern Ocean. After nearly 17 months on the ice, they were finally free of it. But freedom came at a terrible price. Now they were in small open boats in one of the most violent seas on Earth, with waves that could reach 40 feet high, temperatures well below freezing, and no land in sight. They had escaped the ice prison, but now they faced the ocean. And the ocean, as they would soon discover, could be even more merciless than the ice. 28 exhausted, hungry men in 3 tiny boats, rowing and sailing toward a thin hope of land somewhere beyond the horizon. The endurance was gone. Patience Camp was gone. Now there was only the endless gray sea, the cold, and Shackleton's unwavering determination to bring every single man home alive. The most desperate phase of their journey was about to begin. The Southern Ocean is the most treacherous body of water on Earth. Winds circle the globe unobstructed by land, whipping the seas into mountainous waves. Temperatures hover just above freezing, and falling into the water means death within minutes. Into this hell, Shackleton launched his 3 small lifeboats carrying 28 exhausted men. They had been living on ice for over a year, their bodies weakened, their spirits tested to the breaking point. Now they faced perhaps the most dangerous phase of their entire ordeal, a desperate voyage across open ocean toward a destination they could barely hope to reach. Shackleton's navigation options were limited and grim. The nearest known land was Elephant Island, over 100 miles to the northwest. It was a desolate, uninhabited rock, but it was solid ground. Beyond that lay South Georgia Island, over 800 miles away across the worst seas imaginable. For now, Elephant Island was their only realistic hope. Worsley, the navigator, took readings whenever the sun briefly appeared through the clouds. They had salvaged a sextant and chronometer, but taking accurate readings from a pitching boat in rough seas was nearly impossible. Yet somehow, Worsley managed. The conditions in the boats were almost unimaginable. The men were constantly soaked with freezing seawater. Waves crashed over the boats continuously, drenching everyone aboard. There was no shelter, no way to get dry or warm. They took turns at the oars, rowing through the night, through storms, through exhaustion that went beyond anything they had experienced. Frostbite attacked their hands and feet. Their clothes froze solid on their bodies. Some men developed saltwater boils from constant exposure to the sea. They bailed water endlessly, using whatever containers they had, knowing that if they stopped, the boats would swamp and sink. Sleep was nearly impossible. They would doze for minutes while slumped over oars, then jerk awake as waves struck. The boats had to stay together in case one capsized or needed help, but in the darkness and storm, they sometimes lost sight of each other, causing panic until they reunited at dawn. Shackleton rotated between the boats when conditions allowed, checking on different crew members, offering encouragement, somehow maintaining that unshakable calm that kept them believing survival was possible. Food and water became critical concerns. Their supplies had been soaked with seawater. Biscuits were ruined. The small amount of fresh water they had was contaminated with salt. They melted ice chunks when they could find them floating in the sea, but this required stopping and taking precious time. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. They rationed what little food remained, but portions were tiny. Men began to hallucinate from exhaustion and dehydration. Some saw ships in the distance that weren't there. Others heard voices calling from the waves. On the third night, they faced a new terror. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the spray freezing on the boats began to accumulate as ice. The weight of ice building up on the boats threatened to capsize them. Men had to chip away at the ice constantly with whatever tools they had, their frozen hands barely able to grip the implements. One of the boats, the Dudley Docker, began to take on water faster than they could bail. They discovered the hull had been damaged, likely from ice during the launch. McNeish, the carpenter, performed emergency repairs in the middle of the ocean, working by feel in darkness while waves crashed over him. For 7 days and nights, they endured this maritime nightmare. 7 days of rowing, bailing, freezing, and somehow continuing. Men began to reach their breaking point. Some wanted to give up, to just stop rowing and let the sea take them. But Shackleton wouldn't allow it. He moved between the boats, shouting encouragement, sometimes ordering men to keep rowing, sometimes pleading with them. He shared his own meager rations with those who seemed weakest. He never showed doubt, never showed fear, even though he must have felt both. On April 15, 1916, through the spray and mist, someone spotted it, land. Elephant Island's dark cliffs rose from the sea like a vision. The men could barely believe it. After 7 days in the boats, after months on the ice, after everything they had endured, there was solid ground ahead. But reaching it proved nearly as difficult as finding it. The island was surrounded by reefs and pounding surf. They had to circle around, searching for a safe landing spot, their exhausted bodies pushed to continue just a little longer. Finally, they found a small beach. The boats rode the surf in, men leaping out to drag them ashore. And then, for the first time in 497 days, since they had last been on South Georgia Island over 16 months ago, they stood on solid, unmoving land. Some men fell to their knees. Others simply collapsed. A few grabbed rocks and kissed them. They had made it. Against all odds, all 28 men had survived the ice, the boats, and the ocean. They were alive. But their celebration was short-lived. Elephant Island was land, yes, but it was hardly salvation. The island was a desolate, storm-battered rock at the edge of the world. No vegetation grew there. No ships ever came there. There was no shelter except what they could build. They had escaped the ice and survived the ocean, but they were still stranded, still hungry, still 1,000 miles from any hope of rescue. And now Shackleton faced perhaps his hardest decision yet. No one knew they were on Elephant Island. No rescue would come searching for them here. If they waited, they would eventually run out of food and die on this barren rock. Someone would have to go for help. Someone would have to sail across 800 miles of the worst ocean on Earth to reach South Georgia Island, then cross the island's unmapped, mountainous interior to reach the whaling stations on the other side. It was a journey that seemed impossible. But Shackleton had already done the impossible just getting them this far. And he knew exactly who would make that journey, himself and 5 volunteers. The greatest boat voyage in history was about to begin. Shackleton faced an impossible choice, but there was really no choice at all. 28 men on a barren rock with limited supplies and no hope of rescue. Someone had to go for help, and that someone had to be him. He selected 5 men to accompany him: Frank Worsley, the navigator whose skill would be essential; Tom Crean, tough as nails and utterly dependable; Harry McNish, the carpenter who would modify the boat; Timothy McCarthy, an able seaman; and John Vincent, a physically strong man despite his difficult personality. They would take the largest lifeboat, the 22-foot James Caird, and attempt to reach South Georgia Island across 800 miles of the world's most dangerous ocean. The odds were staggering. The Drake Passage, which they would have to cross, was legendary for its violence. Waves regularly reached 50 feet. Winds could exceed hurricane force. Icebergs lurked in the fog. They would be attempting this journey in a small open boat designed for coastal work, not ocean crossings. McNish set to work modifying the James Caird, raising the sides with salvaged wood, creating a canvas deck to provide minimal shelter and prevent the boat from swamping. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. On April 24, 1916, 10 days after reaching Elephant Island, Shackleton and his 5 companions pushed the James Caird back into the sea. 22 men remained behind under Frank Wild's command, watching their leader sail away toward an uncertain fate. Wild gathered the remaining crew and made them a promise: Shackleton would return for them. He didn't say if, he said when. Those left behind had their own struggle for survival ahead, sheltering under the overturned remaining boats, hunting seals and penguins, enduring storms and cold, waiting and hoping. But Shackleton's voyage would become the stuff of legend. For 17 days, 6 men sailed across the Southern Ocean in conditions that defy belief. The James Caird was constantly battered by enormous waves. Water poured over them continuously. Everything was soaked. The men took turns at the helm and the pump, bailing water that seemed endless. They couldn't cook, could barely eat the frozen rations they had brought. Ice formed on the boat, requiring constant chipping to prevent capsizing. Sleep was almost impossible in the cramped, wet space beneath the canvas deck. Worsley performed navigation miracles. Taking sun sights from a pitching boat was extraordinarily difficult, yet he managed to calculate their position with remarkable accuracy using brief glimpses of the sun through storm clouds. They had to hit South Georgia Island precisely. Miss it, and they would sail on into the Atlantic with no hope of return. The margin for error was almost non-existent, yet Worsley threaded that needle. His skill, combined with Shackleton's leadership and the crew's endurance, kept them alive and on course. On the 10th day, they encountered what sailors call a rogue wave. A monster that dwarfed even the massive seas they had been battling. Shackleton, who had spent his life at sea, later said he had never seen anything like it in 30 years of sailing. The wave rose behind them like a moving mountain. For a moment, they thought it would overwhelm them completely, smash the boat to pieces and end everything. But the James Caird rode up that impossible wall of water and somehow survived. They bailed frantically, pumping out hundreds of gallons that had poured aboard, and kept sailing. 17 days after leaving Elephant Island, on May 8, they glimpsed land through the spray. South Georgia Island. They had crossed 800 miles of the Southern Ocean in an open boat, one of the greatest feats of navigation and seamanship in history. But their ordeal wasn't over. They had reached the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations were on the northern coast, and they had made landfall on the southern side. Mountains rose before them, unmapped and supposedly impassable. They tried to sail around the island, but a hurricane-force storm drove them back. The James Caird was falling apart, the men were at the absolute end of their endurance. They managed to land in King Haakon Bay on the southern coast, but it was still miles from the whaling stations. Shackleton made yet another hard decision. He would cross the island's mountainous interior on foot. No one had ever done it. They had no proper climbing equipment, no maps, no idea what lay ahead. But sitting and waiting was not an option. Shackleton chose Worsley and Crean to accompany him. McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent would wait at the landing site, too exhausted to continue. On May 19, after a brief rest, the three men began walking. They carried minimal supplies, a rope, an adze as an ice axe, and the carpenter's adze. They had no tent, no sleeping bags. If they couldn't make it across in one push, they would freeze to death. The march that followed was a 36-hour epic of mountaineering improvisation. They climbed ice slopes, descended treacherous ridges, occasionally had to backtrack when they reached impassable cliffs. At one point, trapped on a mountain with darkness falling and temperatures plummeting, they faced certain death if they remained. Shackleton proposed something insane: they would slide down a steep ice slope in the darkness, not knowing what lay below. It might end in a cliff. It might save them. They had no choice. They sat down, holding onto each other, and slid. They plummeted down the mountain in a terrifying descent, somehow emerging at the bottom bruised but alive. They kept walking through the night, exhaustion turning their minds foggy, but somehow placing one foot in front of the other. At dawn on May 20, they heard something that seemed like a hallucination, a steam whistle. The whaling station's morning whistle calling men to work. They stumbled down the final slopes, bearded, filthy, their clothes in tatters, looking more like wild men than the explorers who had left civilization nearly 2 years earlier. The Norwegian whalers at Stromness station initially didn't recognize them. When they realized who stood before them, they were stunned into silence. These men were supposed to be dead. Shackleton had no time for rest. His first question: when was the war over? The whalers told him it still raged. His second action: organize a rescue for the 3 men left on the other side of South Georgia. They were picked up the same day. Then came the hardest part: rescuing the 22 men still stranded on Elephant Island. Shackleton tried immediately, but pack ice blocked the first 3 rescue attempts over the following months. He borrowed ships, begged governments for help, drove himself relentlessly. Finally, on August 30, 1916, 4 months after he had left them, Shackleton returned to Elephant Island aboard a Chilean ship. Frank Wild had kept his promise, maintaining hope and discipline among the stranded men. When the ship appeared, Wild simply said, "There's the boss." All 22 men were alive. Against every conceivable odd, despite nearly 2 years in the Antarctic, despite the crushing of their ship, despite living on ice for months, despite desperate boat journeys and starvation rations, despite everything that should have killed them, all 28 men survived. When Shackleton landed and counted his men, he broke down briefly, overcome with relief. They had failed to cross Antarctica. They had lost their ship and nearly everything they owned. But they had achieved something far more important: they had survived together, and not a single life had been lost. In an age when polar expeditions often ended in death, when leaders sacrificed men for glory, Shackleton had done the impossible. He had brought them all home. The crew returned to a world transformed by war. Many immediately enlisted, having missed the conflict they had left behind. Some would die in the trenches of Europe, surviving the Antarctic only to fall to bullets and gas. But they never forgot what they had endured together, and the world would never forget their story. Shackleton's endurance expedition had failed in its objective but had succeeded in something greater, proving what human beings can endure, what leadership means, and what courage looks like when everything seems lost. This was not just a survival story. This was proof that with determination, unity, and leadership that values every life, humans can overcome the impossible. Shackleton's legacy wasn't a record or a conquest. It was 28 men, alive against all odds, because one man refused to give up on them. In the end, that mattered more than any pole ever reached or any continent ever crossed.